Boston in the fall carried a charm of its own. Leaves of amber and crimson adorned the streets, whispering promises of transformation. Within the historic townhouse on Beacon Hill, Ethan Wallace sat at his polished oak desk, the weight of his latest novel pressing heavily upon him. His fingers hovered over the keys of his typewriter, yet his thoughts were miles away. Something felt off, though he couldn't place exactly what. Claire Wallace, his wife of 3 decades, had always been a steadfast presence in his life. Together they had built a legacy of respect and admiration in Boston's elite circles. She, a philanthropist with a reputation for grace, and he, a novelist whose words captured hearts. Their life seemed perfect. Too perfect. "Ethan, I'm heading out," Claire's voice echoed from the foyer. She stood in a tailored beige coat, clutching her leather handbag. Her smile seemed effortless, but her eyes darted away too quickly. "For another charity meeting?" Ethan asked, glancing at her from his desk. "Yes," she replied quickly. "It's for the literacy program. We're finalizing the details for the gala next month." He nodded absently, though something tugged at the back of his mind. The rhythm of their life had begun to change subtly. Claire's outings were more frequent, her phone constantly buzzing with messages. Her laughter, once reserved for their late-night conversations, now echoed softly from behind closed doors when she thought he wasn't listening. Ethan dismissed the unease. He had deadlines looming and characters waiting to be brought to life. Yet as the door clicked shut, he found himself staring at the empty space Claire had left behind. He shook his head and turned back to his work. A busy imagination, he thought, was both a gift and a curse. That evening, the Wallace home filled with the comforting aroma of roasted chicken. Ethan found Claire in the kitchen, humming softly to herself. The scene was domestic perfection. A warm glow cast from the pendant lights, the quiet clink of silverware. Yet there was something distant in the way she avoided meeting his gaze. "How was the meeting?" Ethan ventured as he poured himself a glass of wine. "Productive," Claire said with a tight smile. "The committee's excited about the auction. It's going to be spectacular." "Good," Ethan murmured, though his words lacked conviction. He watched her carefully. She was perfectly poised, her every movement deliberate. But the way she glanced at her phone when she thought he wasn't looking, it was a subtle betrayal of her own calm. As the days passed, Ethan's unease grew. He couldn't pinpoint when it had started, but it had taken root, and now it refused to be ignored. Claire's laughter on the phone had changed. Her presence in their home felt fleeting. And then there was Ryan Carter, the real estate agent. A charming man Claire had introduced at a charity gala weeks ago. Ethan remembered how Claire had laughed at Ryan's jokes in a way she hadn't with him in years. It had pricked at something deep within him. One evening, Claire's phone buzzed while she was upstairs. Ethan's gaze flickered to the screen. A name appeared. R. His heart tightened, though he told himself it was nothing. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted. Ethan stood in the middle of their grand living room, a place once filled with warmth and laughter, now heavy with unspoken tension. He looked at the family portraits lining the wall, their smiles frozen in time. Was he imagining it? Or had their lives quietly unraveled while he was too absorbed in his novels to notice? As Claire descended the staircase, her heels clicking against the wooden steps, Ethan turned toward her. "Who's R?" he asked casually, though the tightness in his voice betrayed his effort to remain nonchalant. Claire stopped mid-step, her expression briefly flickering with something Ethan couldn't quite identify. Then she smiled. Too quickly, too smoothly. "It's Ruth, one of the committee members. Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Ethan replied, letting it drop. But as she breezed past him, the perfume she always wore lingered in the air, intoxicating and faintly bittersweet. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His gut told him something was wrong, but his mind clung to logic. Claire had been his partner, his confidant, his anchor. Could she really be hiding something from him? The question haunted him long after Claire's soft breathing signaled she was asleep. Something was amiss. He was certain of it now, and certainty was the first crack in the mask of perfection they had so carefully built. The morning sun poured through the windows of Ethan Wallace's study, illuminating the pages of his manuscript scattered across the desk. Yet his thoughts weren't on the characters he had so carefully crafted. They were on Claire. Her behavior lingered in his mind like a stubborn shadow. He replayed the moments that had unsettled him, the secretive phone calls, the hasty explanations, the evasive answers. And then there was the name, R. Who was this R? The question had taken root, gnawing at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Downstairs, Claire moved about the kitchen with her usual precision, her phone never far from reach. Ethan watched her from the doorway, trying to decipher the emotions beneath her composed demeanor. There was something different, something distant. "Busy day ahead?" Ethan asked casually, stepping into the room. Claire glanced at him, her smile as polished as ever. "Just the usual. Meetings with the committee and then finalizing the auction list for the gala." He nodded but didn't respond. Instead, his eyes drifted to her phone lying face down on the counter. "Maybe we should have dinner out tonight," he suggested, breaking the silence. Claire hesitated, her hand hovering over the kettle. I think I'll be home late. The committee meeting might run long." Her response was quick, almost rehearsed, and Ethan felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He didn't press further. Pushing too hard now would only raise her defenses. Later that day, Ethan found himself at the Boston Public Library, a place that usually sparked inspiration. Today, however, his mind refused to focus. As he stared at the blank page before him, his phone buzzed, a message from Claire. "Meeting going well. Don't wait up for me tonight." The text was brief, impersonal. It felt more like a transaction than a message from his wife. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to Ryan Carter, the charming real estate agent Claire had introduced at the gala. His confidence, the way he made Claire laugh, it had pricked something in Ethan. It wasn't jealousy, not yet. But the memory lingered, feeding the doubts that had begun to fester. Returning home that evening, Ethan noticed the absence of Claire's car in the driveway. The house felt emptier than usual, its silence punctuated only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. As Ethan made his way to the living room, his eyes fell on Claire's laptop resting on the coffee table. A pang of hesitation gripped him. Was he really about to do this? He had never been the type to snoop, but the questions swirling in his mind refused to be ignored. Sitting down, Ethan opened the laptop. The screen blinked to life, revealing Claire's desktop, a pristine collection of folders neatly arranged. His fingers hovered over the trackpad before clicking on a folder labeled Charity Docs. Inside, everything appeared ordinary: spreadsheets, event schedules, donor lists. But then his gaze landed on another folder, tucked away in the corner of the screen. It was labeled Personal. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest. His rational mind urged him to close the laptop, to respect Claire's privacy. But something deeper, something primal, urged him forward. With a deep breath, he clicked the folder. Inside, a series of emails appeared. They were addressed to someone named Ryan. Ethan's pulse quickened as he opened the first one. "Last night was incredible. I can't wait to see you again." The words stared back at him, each one a dagger piercing the foundation of his marriage. He opened another email, then another. The messages were intimate, undeniable. Claire wasn't just hiding something. She was living an entirely separate life. The realization hit Ethan like a freight train. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. The woman he had loved, trusted, and built a life with was betraying him. The laptop screen dimmed as if sensing his despair, but Ethan barely noticed. He closed it gently, his hands trembling. Upstairs, the clock struck midnight, its chime echoing through the empty house. In that moment, Ethan knew that the cracks in the foundation of their marriage weren't just superficial. They ran deep, threatening to bring everything crashing down. The next morning brought no clarity, only the sharp edge of reality cutting into Ethan Wallace's chest. The emails he had read the night before played on a relentless loop in his mind. Each word seemed louder, sharper, more damning than the last. Claire had betrayed him, and the evidence was undeniable. But what was he supposed to do now? Ethan sat at the dining table, nursing a cup of black coffee gone cold. Claire moved around the kitchen with her usual ease, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The domestic serenity felt like a cruel joke. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice light, casual. Ethan glanced at her, searching her face for something, guilt, hesitation, anything, but her expression was calm, her smile practiced. "Not really," he said flatly. She paused, her hands lingering on the countertop, but quickly recovered. "You've been working too hard," she offered. He didn't respond. Instead, he watched as she turned back to her task, her movements deliberate, almost rehearsed. Did she know he'd seen the emails? Did she sense the weight of his silence? Later that day, Ethan found himself standing in the middle of their living room, staring at the same laptop that had upended his world. His hands itched to open it again, to scour every email, every message for answers. But he stopped himself. This wasn't how he wanted to do it. Instead, he grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The crisp autumn air was a welcome reprieve, sharpening his focus. He needed to know more. He needed proof, concrete, indisputable evidence, and he knew exactly how to get it. By the time Ethan returned home that evening, he had already contacted a private investigator. The man had come highly recommended, known for his discretion and tenacity. Ethan had explained the situation in clipped, measured sentences, careful not to let his emotions spill over. "I need to know everything," Ethan had said. "Where she goes, who she's with. No detail is too small." The investigator had nodded, his demeanor professional yet sympathetic. "I'll start immediately," he assured Ethan. That night, Ethan sat in his study, staring blankly at the typewriter in front of him. Words eluded him. His mind was a storm of anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of loss. How had they gotten here? How had the life they built together unraveled so completely without him even noticing? The sound of Claire's footsteps brought him back to the present. She appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. "You've been quiet," she said softly, stepping into the room. Ethan turned to face her, forcing a smile he didn't feel. "Just caught up in the story," he lied. She nodded, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Concern, perhaps. Or maybe guilt. As she left, Ethan's gaze followed her until she disappeared down the hall. The house felt larger, emptier, as if the distance between them was growing with each passing moment. 2 days later, the investigator called. "Mr. Wallace," he began, his voice steady yet cautious. "I have something you'll want to see." Ethan met the man at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. The investigator slid a folder across the table, its contents neatly organized. Inside were photographs, grainy but unmistakable. Claire and Ryan Carter sitting together at a restaurant, their body language intimate. Another photo showed them leaving a hotel, their hands brushing as they walked. Ethan's jaw tightened as he flipped through the images. The reality he had been trying to avoid was now laid bare before him, but it was the last photo that hit him the hardest. It wasn't just Claire and Ryan. There was another woman, young, striking, and unmistakably familiar with Ryan. The investigator's voice cut through Ethan's spiraling thoughts. "It seems Mr. Carter has been seeing more than just your wife," he said. Ethan's grip on the folder tightened. The betrayal was no longer a singular act. It was layered, tangled, and far more insidious than he had imagined. As he left the cafe, the weight of the evidence settled heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about Claire's infidelity anymore. There was something darker at play, something Ethan was determined to uncover. The walls of Ethan's study seemed to close in on him as he stared at the photographs scattered across his desk. Each one felt like a blow to the life he thought he knew. Claire, sitting across from Ryan Carter, her face lit with a warmth Ethan hadn't seen in years. The subtle tilt of her head, the way her fingers brushed his. It was intimacy in its purest form, captured on film. But the final photo lingered the longest. Ryan, arm casually slung over the shoulder of another woman outside the same hotel. The investigator's words echoed in Ethan's mind. "Ryan's not exclusive to your wife." The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was layered with deceit that made Ethan's chest tighten with anger and confusion. The investigator had called again earlier that day. "Mr. Wallace, there's more," he'd said with measured gravity. "I think you should see for yourself." Now Ethan found himself sitting in the dim corner of a downtown cafe, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Across from him, the investigator laid out the plan. "Tomorrow night they're meeting again," the man said, his voice low. "The hotel downtown. I'll be there to document everything. But if you want answers directly—" He hesitated, his gaze meeting Ethan's. "You'll need to see it with your own eyes." The suggestion struck Ethan like a challenge. Did he want to confront the truth head-on? Or would the images suffice, allowing him to retreat into anger and sorrow from the safety of his home? But deep down, Ethan already knew his answer. He needed to see them, needed to see her. The following evening, Ethan parked his car several blocks away from the hotel, his heart pounding as he made his way toward the entrance. The city lights blurred in his periphery, the hum of traffic a distant murmur. All he could focus on was the looming reality waiting for him inside. The lobby was polished and pristine, a stark contrast to the chaos in Ethan's mind. He slipped into a seat near the bar, his position carefully chosen to keep him out of sight while offering a clear view of the entrance. Time ticked by painfully slowly, every second stretching into an eternity. At last, Claire arrived. She walked in with the grace and poise that had always defined her, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Ryan followed close behind, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The sight made Ethan's stomach churn. They didn't linger in the lobby. After a brief exchange at the reception desk, they made their way to the elevators. Ethan's eyes followed them until the metal doors slid shut, erasing them from view. A part of him wanted to storm after them, to demand answers, to unleash the fury that had been simmering inside him for days. But another part of him, calmer, more calculated, knew it wasn't the time. Not yet. Minutes later, the investigator approached, his expression unreadable. "Room 1403, he murmured before slipping back into the shadows. Ethan stared at the elevator bank, his mind racing. What was he hoping to achieve by going up there? Did he want confrontation or confirmation? The thought of seeing them together, of hearing their lies unravel in real time, both terrified and compelled him. But just as he was about to stand, the elevator doors opened again. Ryan stepped out alone, his phone pressed to his ear. Ethan froze, watching as the man strode toward the lobby's exit, his voice low but hurried. A moment later, the other woman from the photograph entered the hotel, her expression confident, almost smug. Ethan's pulse quickened. The pieces were falling into place, and they painted a picture far more complex than he'd imagined. Ryan wasn't just cheating on Claire, he was using her. The truth was darker, more insidious, and Ethan wasn't sure how much more he could take. As he left the hotel that night, the cold air hit him like a slap, clearing the fog of his thoughts. This wasn't just about Claire anymore. Ryan's deception ran deep, and Ethan was determined to uncover the full extent of it. But one thing was certain, nothing about his life, his marriage, or his understanding of trust would ever be the same. Ethan Wallace sat in the dim light of his study, the photographs spread out before him like a puzzle that had no satisfying resolution. He had spent the past few days oscillating between fury and disbelief, but now all that was left was a bone-deep exhaustion. The weight of betrayal bore down on him, crushing his resolve to remain passive. Tonight, he would confront Claire. The house was unnervingly quiet when Claire walked through the door. The sharp click of her heels echoed against the hardwood floor, an unspoken announcement of her return. She set her bag down by the foyer and paused, sensing something in the air. Her eyes scanned the dimly lit living room until they landed on Ethan, seated in his armchair, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. "You're up late," she said, her voice cautious. Ethan gestured toward the couch across from him. "Sit," he said flatly. Claire hesitated, her hand lingering on the back of the chair. "Is something wrong?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze piercing and steady. "Do you love him?" The question hit like a thunderclap, freezing Claire in place. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She blinked, and then, slowly, her composure began to crumble. "What are you talking about?" she finally managed, her voice shaking. "Don't lie to me, Claire," Ethan said, his tone sharper now. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I've seen the emails. I've seen the photos. So I'll ask you again. Do you love him?" Her hands trembled as she sank into the couch. For a moment it seemed as though she might deny everything, but then her shoulders sagged under the weight of her own guilt. "No," she whispered. "I don't love him." The admission didn't bring Ethan any comfort. If anything, it deepened the ache in his chest. "Then why, Claire? Why would you do this to us?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking. "You've been so consumed with your books, your career. I felt invisible, Ethan, like I didn't matter anymore." Ethan's jaw clenched. "So you turned to him, to a man who's using you?" Claire flinched as if he had struck her. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ryan," Ethan said, spitting the name like poison. "He's not faithful to you, Claire. He's not who you think he is. I've seen him with someone else, another woman." The color drained from her face. For a moment she seemed to stop breathing. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You're lying." Ethan leaned back, his expression hardened. "Am I? Or are you just afraid to admit that you've been played?" Claire buried her face in her hands, her body trembling with silent sobs. The room fell into a suffocating silence, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on both of them. Finally, Claire looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said. I just wanted to feel alive again." "And now?" Ethan asked, his voice cold. "What do you want now?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know how to fix this." Ethan stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "Maybe it can't be fixed," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He turned toward the stairs, his back to her. "I need time to think. Don't wait up." As he ascended the staircase, leaving Claire alone in the living room, Ethan felt a hollow emptiness settle in his chest. This was a confrontation he had hoped he would never have to face, and yet it had brought him no peace. The foundation of their marriage was shattered, and he wasn't sure if it could ever be rebuilt. In the silence of the night, both of them sat with the weight of their choices, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sun pierced through the curtains of Ethan's study, but its warmth felt meaningless. He sat in his chair, staring at the laptop screen, where the damning emails between Claire and Ryan were displayed. The words burned into his memory, each phrase a reminder of the betrayal that had dismantled the life he thought he knew. But this morning was different. Ethan had reached his breaking point. The storm of emotions inside him, anger, pain, humiliation, had given way to a single, consuming desire: vengeance. He opened a blank email, attached the most incriminating messages, and typed a single line: "The truth will come out." With one click, the email was sent, anonymously, to several influential contacts in Boston's social circles. Ethan's hands trembled, but there was no turning back now. By noon, the ripple effect had begun. The emails spread like wildfire through group chats, inboxes, and eventually social media. The subject lines were damning: "Betrayal behind closed doors," and "The secret life of Claire Wallace." Boston's elite feasted on the scandal, and whispers of infidelity and deceit echoed through every corner of the city. Claire returned home that evening, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her face was pale, her movements frantic. "Ethan," she called out, her voice trembling. "What's happening? Why are people calling me about these emails?" Ethan emerged from the kitchen, his expression cold and unyielding. "I told you," he said simply. "The truth always comes out." Claire's face crumpled as she sank onto the couch. "You did this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You did this," Ethan retorted, his voice low but filled with barely contained rage. "I just made sure the world knew." The fallout was swift and unforgiving. Claire's reputation as a respected philanthropist was shattered. Invitations to galas and events were rescinded. Her social media accounts flooded with scornful comments. Even her closest friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. But the consequences extended beyond Claire. Ryan Carter's professional life took a severe blow. Several clients pulled their listings from his firm, unwilling to trust a man entangled in such controversy. In a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation, Ryan released a public statement denying the affair. The emails were fabricated, he claimed. Claire Wallace became obsessed with me. I never had any inappropriate relationship with her. The statement sent shockwaves through Boston's gossip mill, further complicating the narrative. Suddenly, Claire was not only a cheater, but a potential liar. The public sympathy shifted and the story spiraled into a media frenzy. Ethan watched the chaos unfold with a hollow sense of satisfaction. But even as he saw Claire's world crumble, he couldn't shake the emptiness that had taken root in his own heart. This wasn't justice, it was destruction. And now, he was as much a part of it as she was. One evening, Ethan overheard Claire on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice was quiet, pleading. "Ryan, please," she said. "You know the truth. You can't let them think—" Her words trailed off as Ethan entered the room. She turned to him, her face a mask of desperation. "Ethan, Save it," he said, cutting her off. "You made your choices. Live with them." As the days passed, the scandal continued to consume their lives. Paparazzi camped outside their home, reporters hounded Ethan for a comment, and Claire's name became synonymous with betrayal. The once pristine walls of their home now felt like a prison, suffocating them both. For Ethan, the public fallout was a double-edged sword. He had exposed the truth, but in doing so, he had destroyed any hope of salvaging what remained of their life together. Claire was a pariah, Ryan was a liar, and Ethan was left with nothing but the wreckage of his marriage and the hollow satisfaction of revenge. The sterile walls of the courtroom were a stark contrast to the chaos Ethan Wallace had lived through over the past weeks. Seated at the defendant's table, he looked across the room where Claire sat with her attorney. She was poised, her face a mask of defiance, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. This wasn't the woman he had married 30 years ago. Ethan's attorney, Jonathan Marks, leaned in, his voice low. "Stay calm, Ethan. Today is about facts, not emotions." Ethan nodded, though his chest felt tight. The public fallout had been brutal, but the legal battle was worse. Claire had filed for divorce just days after the scandal broke, and now they were fighting over the life they had built together, their home, their finances, and most painfully, their memories. The courtroom hushed as the judge entered, her gavel striking with authority. The proceedings began with Claire's attorney presenting her case. Mrs. Wallace dedicated decades to supporting her husband's career, the lawyer began. While Mr. Wallace was consumed with his novels, she maintained the household, cultivated their social standing, and built her philanthropic legacy. Her contributions deserve recognition and equitable compensation. Ethan clenched his jaw. Equitable. The word felt like an insult. Jonathan stood, his voice steady. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge Mrs. Wallace's contributions, we must also consider the events that led to this divorce. Mr. Wallace's career provided the foundation for their lifestyle. Furthermore, the betrayal of trust in this marriage was not initiated by my client." The courtroom murmured as Jonathan slid a folder onto the judge's desk. Inside were the emails and photographs that had set everything into motion. Claire's attorney immediately objected. "Your Honor, this evidence is prejudicial and irrelevant to the division of assets." The judge raised her hand, silencing the room. "I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Marks." As the evidence was presented, Ethan watched Claire closely. She remained composed, though her hands gripped the armrests of her chair tightly. Then came the twist. During the cross-examination, Jonathan revealed a financial discrepancy, a withdrawal of $50,000 from their joint account. "Mrs. Wallace," Jonathan said, his tone sharp, "can you explain why this amount was transferred to an account linked to Ryan Carter?" The courtroom fell silent. Claire's lips parted, but no words came. Finally, she stammered, "It was for a business investment." "Investment?" Jonathan pressed. "Or was it a personal gift?" Claire's attorney quickly interjected, calling for a recess, but the damage was done. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the revelation settling over him like a storm cloud. She hadn't just betrayed him emotionally, she had jeopardized their financial stability for a man who had used her. The recess brought no relief. Ethan stood by the courthouse window, staring out at the bustling city below. Jonathan joined him, his expression grim. "This complicates things," Jonathan admitted. It might help your case, but it could also drag this out longer." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I just want this to be over." When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was charged. Claire's attorney pivoted, attempting to portray Ethan as vindictive, citing the leaked emails as evidence of his intent to humiliate her. "This divorce isn't just about division of assets," the lawyer argued. "It's about Mr. Wallace's efforts to destroy Mrs. Wallace's reputation." Ethan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. It wasn't about humiliation, it was about truth. But in this room, truth was malleable, shaped by whoever wielded it best. As the judge adjourned for the day, Ethan felt a hollowness settle in his chest. The legal battle was far from over, and each day chipped away at what little resolve he had left. Walking past Claire on his way out, he caught her gaze for a fleeting moment. There was no anger there, no defiance, only a weariness that mirrored his own. For the first time, Ethan wondered if either of them would come out of this unscathed. The courthouse was quieter than usual, its sterile halls echoing with the occasional shuffle of shoes and distant murmurs. Ethan Wallace sat in a corner of the lobby, scrolling through his phone, trying to distract himself from the looming storm that had become his life. Then his phone vibrated, a call from the private investigator. Ethan hesitated before answering. "Mr. Wallace," the investigator said without preamble, "I've uncovered new information about Ryan Carter. You'll want to hear this." Ethan gripped the phone tightly, his voice steady. "What is it?" "Ryan isn't just a cheater, he's a con artist. He's been targeting women like Claire for years, using them for financial gain and connections. But there's more. I found records of significant debts and shady dealings in his past. He's not who he pretends to be." The words hit Ethan like a freight train. His anger toward Claire, though still sharp, now shared space with a bitter satisfaction. She had trusted Ryan, had risked everything for him, and now, it seemed, she was just another mark in his game. The next day, Ethan sat across from Jonathan Marks in his office, the investigator's report spread out between them. Jonathan scanned the documents, his face a mask of professional detachment. "This changes things," Jonathan said finally. "If we present this in court, it undermines Claire's credibility even further. Her judgment is now directly tied to someone with a criminal history. It also explains the missing money." Ethan nodded, though a pang of sadness tugged at him. This wasn't just a victory, it was a revelation of how far their marriage had fallen. Hours later, Claire sat alone in her dimly lit living room. The curtains were drawn, the air thick with the scent of wilted flowers from an arrangement long forgotten. Her phone buzzed, and she answered without checking the caller ID. "Claire," Ryan's voice drawled on the other end, his usual charm replaced by irritation. "Ryan," she began, her tone shaky. "What's going on? I've been hearing things. About your debts, about other women. Is any of it true?" Ryan chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "You really believed we had something special, didn't you? You were useful, Claire, that's all." The words sliced through her like a knife. Her hand trembled, the phone slipping slightly in her grip. "I gave you everything," she whispered. "And I took it," Ryan replied coldly. "That's how this works." Claire's tears fell freely now, her sobs racking her body. Ryan's voice turned sharper, more impatient. "Grow up, Claire. You're not the victim here. You knew what this was." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Claire dropped the phone onto the coffee table, staring blankly at the wall as the weight of her choices crushed her. The next morning, she arrived at Ethan's house unannounced. He opened the door, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they simply stood there, two people bound by years of shared history and now unimaginable pain. "I need to talk to you," Claire said, her voice raw. Ethan stepped aside, letting her in. They sat across from each other in the living room, the silence between them heavy. "Ryan played me," Claire admitted, her voice trembling. "He used me, just like you said." Ethan's gaze was steady, his anger tempered by exhaustion. "What did you expect, Claire? That a man like him would risk everything for you?" Her lip quivered, but she nodded. "I was stupid, I was desperate, and now I've lost everything." Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. For the first time in weeks, he felt no satisfaction in her suffering. Instead, he saw a woman shattered, a reflection of the life they had destroyed together. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. Claire looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe just forgiveness?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. Forgiveness felt like a foreign concept in the wreckage of their lives. But as he looked at Claire, broken and vulnerable, he realized that holding on to his anger wouldn't rebuild what had been lost. "I don't know if I can give you that," he said honestly, "but I'll try." For the first time in months, they sat in the same room, their anger and pain momentarily replaced by the faintest glimmer of understanding. Ethan Wallace sat alone in his study, the same room where his world had first unraveled. The desk, once cluttered with manuscripts and ideas for new novels, now held only a single notebook and a cup of cold coffee. It had been weeks since Claire's tearful visit, and, though their marriage was irreparable, the anger in his chest had begun to dull, replaced by a hollow ache that left him feeling untethered. The court proceedings were over, the settlement finalized. Claire had taken a significant portion of their assets, including the Cape Cod property Ethan had always cherished. She'd moved into a smaller apartment, far from the circles that had once revered her. Ethan, meanwhile, remained in the townhouse, its silence an oppressive reminder of what he had lost. The world around him continued to turn, but Ethan felt stagnant, unable to move forward. He had thought exposing the truth would bring closure, but instead it had left him with more questions than answers. Was vengeance truly worth the emptiness it left behind? One evening, as the autumn rain pattered against the windows, Ethan found himself staring at the blank pages of his notebook. His fingers hovered over the pen, hesitant, as if afraid to commit his thoughts to paper. But then a memory surfaced, Claire's words from that fateful confrontation. "I just wanted to feel alive again." Ethan sighed, picking up the pen. Slowly, hesitantly, he began to write. The words came haltingly at first, but soon they poured out in a torrent of raw emotion. He didn't write about fictional characters or far-off worlds this time. He wrote about betrayal, about love twisted into something unrecognizable, about the fragile threads that held people together until they didn't. The writing became his anchor, a way to process the chaos of his emotions. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan barely left his study, his mind consumed by the story unfolding on the page. It wasn't a novel, it was a catharsis, and for the first time in months he felt a sense of clarity, as though the act of writing was stitching his fragmented soul back together. One afternoon, as he reviewed the latest chapter, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his son, David. The two hadn't spoken much since the scandal broke. Ethan had avoided his children, ashamed of the spectacle his life had become. But now, the message read simply, "Dad, can we meet?" Ethan hesitated, then replied, "Of course." The following weekend, Ethan sat in a cafe near the Charles River waiting for David. When his son arrived, there was an awkward pause before they embraced, a brief, tentative gesture that spoke volumes. They sat across from each other, the hum of the cafe filling the silences as they navigated the unspoken tension between them. "I've been reading about you," David said finally, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "Mom, Ryan, the emails. It's a mess, Dad." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "It is," he admitted. "I didn't handle it the way I should have." David studied his father for a moment before leaning forward. "But you're still here. You're still you. And I think that matters." The words struck Ethan with a surprising force. For so long he had defined himself by his failures, his inability to see the cracks in his marriage, his impulsive decisions, his anger. But in David's eyes, he saw something else, resilience. They talked for hours about the past, about the future, and about the family they both hoped to rebuild. By the time they parted, Ethan felt lighter, as though a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. That night he returned to his study and finished the last chapter of his manuscript. As he typed the final sentence, a sense of accomplishment washed over him, not because he had written a bestseller, but because he had found a way to reclaim his purpose. The manuscript, titled The Broken Thread, was published 6 months later. It became an instant hit, not for its sensationalism, but for its raw honesty. Readers connected with Ethan's vulnerability. his willingness to confront the darkest parts of himself and emerge stronger on the other side. For Ethan, the success wasn't about accolades or sales, it was about survival, and as he stood at a book signing, pen in hand, he looked at the faces of his readers and realized that, for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. The bookstore was bustling with life. Readers wandered through aisles, their voices blending with the soft hum of music in the background. At the far end, a table adorned with stacks of Ethan Wallace's latest book, The Broken Thread, stood as the centerpiece. Ethan sat behind it, signing copies for a line of eager readers. Each interaction was brief but meaningful. Some offered praise, others shared how the book resonated with their own struggles. Ethan listened, nodding, his heart lighter with each word. He had written this book to heal himself, but now he realized it was healing others too. As the line thinned, Ethan glanced up and froze. At the back of the store, standing partially obscured by a shelf, was Claire. She hadn't approached him yet, but the hesitation in her posture spoke volumes. He continued signing books, his mind racing. This was the first time he had seen her in months. Their last conversation had been filled with raw emotion and tentative forgiveness, but they hadn't spoken since. Finally, when the last reader left, Claire stepped forward. Her face was pale, her once confident demeanor replaced by something more subdued. She approached the table cautiously, clutching a copy of his book to her chest. "Hello, Ethan," she said softly. "Claire," he replied, his voice steady but guarded. She placed the book on the table. "Would you mind signing it for me?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before picking up his pen. "Of course," he said. He opened the book and paused. "Who should I make it out to?" Claire managed a small smile. "To the woman who taught you how to tell the truth," she said, her tone tinged with self-deprecating humor. Ethan's pen hovered over the page. The words were unexpected, but they carried a weight that only the two of them could understand. He signed the book and handed it back to her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." He nodded, watching as she turned and walked away. The moment felt like an ending, but also a beginning, one they would face separately. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his townhouse. The house was still quiet, but the silence no longer felt oppressive. He poured himself a glass of wine and stepped out onto the balcony, the city lights stretching out before him. He thought about Claire, about the life they had built and the choices that had torn it apart. She had made mistakes, so had he. But now, as he stood there, he realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about finding peace with it. Meanwhile, Claire returned to her small apartment, the signed book clutched tightly in her hands. She set it on her desk, staring at it as tears welled in her eyes. The scandal had stripped her of everything: her reputation, her social standing, even her sense of self. But it had also forced her to confront her choices, to rebuild herself from the ground up. She opened the book, her gaze falling on Ethan's inscription. "To Claire, the woman who reminded me to write from the heart." For the first time in months, she smiled, a real, genuine smile. As the days turned into weeks, life moved forward for both of them. Ethan's book tour took him across the country, where he met readers who shared their own stories of resilience and heartbreak. Each encounter reaffirmed his belief that his pain had not been in vain. Claire, meanwhile, threw herself into her philanthropy work, focusing on causes that felt personal and meaningful. Though her name no longer carried the weight it once did, her efforts were sincere, and she found solace in helping others. Their paths no longer crossed, but they carried the lessons of their shared past. Ethan learned to let go of his anger, to channel his pain into something constructive. Claire learned to face her mistakes, to find strength in her vulnerability. And though their story had ended, it left behind a truth neither of them could deny. Sometimes the greatest love isn't the one that lasts forever, but the one that teaches you how to begin again. Ethan closed his laptop after finishing his next manuscript. He took a deep breath, staring out the window at the world beyond. His life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was his, and for the first time in a long time he felt at peace. What do you think of Ethan Wallace's journey? Do you believe he found the closure he needed? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with viewers worldwide. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories. See you in the next video.